So I'm Mary Boyce, and I have the privilege to be the current Dean of Engineering at the Fu Foundation School of Engineering and Applied Science. And it's a pleasure to begin our evening of reflections from so many friends and colleagues of Bob Gross, who was an incredible and inspiring leader of our School of Engineering and Applied Science. So during his 8-year tenure as dean of this school, he did much to set our school on a path that really took us into the future. Bob joined Columbia as a tenured professor in mechanical engineering. Mechanical engineering is my field, so that's dear to my heart. After having made significant contributions in shock dynamics and supersonic combustion at Fairchild Engines. At Columbia, he was a pioneer and worldwide leader in the field of plasma physics and controlled fusion research, and went on to write a seminal textbook on this topic, Fusion Energy. Along with Professor John Chu from Applied Mathematics, and John's here with us today, he co-founded the Columbia Plasma Physics Laboratory. And this laboratory recently, in 2012, celebrated its 50th anniversary. At Columbia, he also founded and chaired the Department of Applied Physics and Nuclear Engineering, and he also served as chair of mechanical engineering. Bob served as dean from 1982 to 1990, having been appointed by President Michael Sovereign. While dean, Bob was instrumental in moving our school forward in expanding in new directions. His efforts solidified our deliberate expansion into the biomedical engineering field, and also set a path for forming close and integral relationships with the medical school. This is something that continues to expand today. He also recognized our potential as a school to lead in the field of telecommunications, supporting the efforts led by Misha Schwartz to secure one of the very first National Science and Technology Centers awarded by the NSF. And this was in the area of telecommunications research. To further support this center and also further the expansion of our engineering school and our interdisciplinary collaborations with science, where we have had many, many new and expanding collaborations with science since, Bob tirelessly raised substantial funds to build a new research facility, the Morris A. Shapiro Hall, also known as the Center for Engineering and Physical Science Research. This opened in 1992. This new building was critical to the vitality and the growth of our school. And I think we could all recognize that we would not be where we are today as a leading engineering school without this determined leadership. His many contributions to his own field made him a worldwide authority and were recognized by the nation's most prestigious institutions and organizations. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright's Hays Fellowship, was honored for his life's work by Fusion Power Associates in 1992, and he was a fellow of the American Physical Society and the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He also served as a trusted advisor on numerous committees for the Department of Energy. Although this leadership at the national level in his own field, Bob is really going to be very fondly and is very fondly remembered as a dedicated teacher and an energetic colleague and a leader here at Columbia. Aside from his role as dean, he was also the Percy K. and Vida L.W. Hudson Professor of Applied Physics, and he personally advised 25 doctoral students and was also awarded the Great Teacher Award from the Society of Columbia Graduates. He will be remembered as a devoted professor and scholar, a passionate scientist whose work defined the direction of fusion power research in the United States. He will be sorely missed, but his legacy lives on here at Columbia, in the very spaces we walk through and in the hearts and minds of as many students, colleagues, friends, and family. He really set the stage for our school as we continue to expand into the future. And it's really an honor to be one of those who follow in his footsteps. Thank you.
Well, let me add my words of welcome to Dean Boyce's comments. And I welcome all of you on behalf of the Department of Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics. We've all gathered together this evening to celebrate the life of a remarkable individual, Robert A. Gross, who's touched our lives in many ways. There were many dimensions to Bob's life. He was an educator and a teacher. He was an academic leader. He was a scientist and a national leader of research in plasma physics and fusion energy. And he was a mentor at all levels, from PhD student to senior faculty. And he was a devoted head of his family. If you look at tonight's program, you'll see we've tried to span the breadth of roles with the limited number of speakers in the time we have here in St. Paul's. Of course, afterward at the reception in the Applied Physics and Applied Math Department office, there'll be an opportunity for anyone to add their personal reflections to the remarks that we've scheduled here. Now, in the remaining few minutes of my time up here, I'd like to share with you some of my experiences with Bob as my primary mentor, both professionally and personally, and also as the founder of the department we know today as Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics. I first came to Columbia University and met Bob when I was interviewing for an assistant professor position in a cold January of 1977. That was over 41 years ago. Now, first impressions stay with you. And so in my private one-on-one wrap-up interview at the end of a long day here at Columbia, Bob's message to me about the position was simple: Ivy League and New York. Since my interview trip was the very first time I'd ever set foot in New York City, and as a Midwesterner who got his BS degree at Caltech, New York City coming out of bankruptcy in 1977 wasn't exactly reassuring. But Bob explained New York City to me very simply. He said the following, and I quote him here: "New York City has the very best and the very worst of everything. The secret of success here is to enjoy the best and avoid the worst." This was my first lesson in a primary element of Bob's character. Bob was a pragmatic optimist. Every challenge was an opportunity, and this enduring optimism about what was possible, tempered by common sense, never diminished as long as I've known Bob. The corollary of this is that success in life, research, or anything really, is achieved by making the right choices. And I'll return to this theme a bit later. Bob was a great salesman, and so when the Columbia offer arrived, it was an easy decision, even though the $15,000 annual salary was the lowest by far of the three choices I had at the time. Exciting things were happening at Columbia, and I wanted to be a part of it. Bob had persuaded the recently renamed Department of Energy to make a major investment in fusion energy research at Columbia. He used that to triple the size of the plasma physics lab, and he persuaded Columbia President Bill McGill to directly create 2 new tenure-track faculty lines to support the effort. I filled the second of those 2 faculty positions. Peter Likens, who would later go on to become president of Lehigh University and then president of the University of Arizona, had arrived the year before me from UCLA as the new dean of the School of Engineering and Applied Science at Columbia. He was a strong supporter of our expansion of fusion research, and he wanted to restructure the school to enable new fields to prosper. He offered us the opportunity to leave mechanical engineering, where the fusion program was housed, and form a new department built around energy themes of plasma physics and nuclear engineering. So in my first year at Columbia, I had the unique experience of watching Bob and his career-long research colleague, John Chu, plan the creation of a new department to house the fusion energy research effort. Bob and John argued that the dean's proposal was much too narrow intellectually to base any department on, and that to have a stable department, we needed to embed the present fusion plasma physics program as a subfield among a broad array of other subfields of applied physics. And we embracing other areas like laser physics, solid state, condensed matter physics, and also taking on the important teaching role of undergraduate engineering and applied mathematics. And this proposal was accepted as part of a school-wide vote. The entire faculty voted to create 3 new departments in, I think it was the spring of 1978. The 3 departments were Applied Physics and Nuclear Engineering, which Mary mentioned, the original name of our department. Computer Science was created at that same time, and a new Department of Industrial Engineering and Operations Research was created, all taking shape and formed on the 1st of July, 1978. Bob was elected the founding chair of the newly formed AP&E department. The direct successor of that department we now occupy is going to have its 40th birthday this summer. And over those 40 years, the original vision of Bob and John has been realized, evolving from only 9 faculty members solely in the areas of plasma physics and nuclear engineering at its inception, to a department of applied physics in the 1990s of about 15 faculty, which had added active research in optical and laser physics and solid state physics, as well as a small applied mathematics activity, to the present Department of Applied Physics and Applied Mathematics of about 30 faculty, having extended beyond the original plasma physics and fusion energy programs to include solid state, material science, optical and laser physics, medical physics, atmospheric, oceanic, and earth physics, and a fleshed out applied mathematics program, which is now part of the department name. Now, after serving as founding chair, Bob moved on to become dean of the entire School of Engineering in 1982. And when Peter Likens was appointed the co-provost by Columbia, President Sovereign. Bob was a builder, and as a dean, he turned his efforts to strengthening the entire school. And as mentioned by Mary, and as will be, I think, filled out with more detail by the following speakers, Vigil Eel, his most enduring contribution was the construction of the Shapiro Research Building in the mid-1980s with financing from the state of New York. I'll tell one story that maybe is not widely known. Bob told me that the key to this achievement was his arranging for a meeting in Albany with the Columbia President Sovereign, Bob, and they met directly with Governor Mario Cuomo. And as Bob tells it, Governor Cuomo looked at President Sovereign and asked a simple question: is this what you want? The president nodded yes. Cuomo said okay, and the deal was done. Now, Bob's political translation of the governor's question is interesting. He said, well, what Governor was really asking President Sovereign was, if I give you this, don't come back. So I'll conclude my remarks by returning to the theme of making good choices. I received a lot of good advice from Bob over the years, both directly and by example. In making decisions, both large and small, Bob's advice was never to lose sight of the larger enterprise you're a part of. So as a faculty member in a department or a school, a researcher in a group or part of a national effort, as an officer of Columbia University, your choices should further not just your own immediate interests, but further the success of the academic and or research enterprise that we're all a part of here at Columbia. In this sense, I saw Bob not only as a successful individual, but as a statesman in the very best sense of the term, always trying to make the larger enterprise succeed, whether that was creating a new department, building a stronger school, pushing the frontiers of research, or helping to ensure Columbia remains a top-tier national research university. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have had the opportunity to be guided and inspired by Bob Gross. Thank you very much. So I'll now turn the podium over to Zvi Galil, the former chair of our computer science department, Bob's successor, serving 14 years as dean. 12, 12, and is the current dean of the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Zvi.
I actually came to Columbia in 1982, in the year that Bob became dean. In some way, he kind of hired me. And I didn't deal at that time much with him. He was very, very friendly. Every once in a while I'll see him and his wife Ellie. But mostly the chair dealt with him, and we, the young department, were kind of young and cocky, not very popular in the School of Engineering. I'm not sure what Bob's feelings were, but the other departments made it known to us. But we grew up. And the main point I want to make here is the building. First and foremost, I think we made a mistake. It should have been called the Bob Gross Sepser building, not Shapiro. So Bob got the bulk of the money. He got 36 interest-free loans from the state, plus $6 million contribution. That was still not enough. And there was a small loan, and plus the budget system was then terrible, and whoever came to Bob and he needed the support from the university, they said, you know, how will you pay it back? And he said, oh, he just told them, we'll have 100 more master students. Except that in the early 90s, there was a mini recession, if you remember, and there were not 100 master students. So even though the School of Engineering, as it does now much more, subsidize art and science in a big way, they simply took the money from the budget. So the school was almost broke, but it was worth it. Bob decided then to step down, and later, 3 or 4 years later, they changed the system that allowed the school to flourish. The building, I cannot imagine where we would be today without the building. His contribution was immense. First of all, the school more than doubled in size. We wouldn't have biomedical engineering. So we would remain a third-rate engineering school. And with the building, and since then, the engineering school at Columbia is taking off, especially under the leadership of Mary, and the sky's the limit. I will not be surprised if in the next few years we will be in the top 10. And that's first and foremost. That was the most important part. Without it, there won't be such a wonderful engineering school. After Bob stepped down, I would see him, because we all live, I still have an apartment in the Golden Coast in Riverside Drive, and I met him and Ellie, always friendly. He was always supportive. When I was dean, he was always supportive, very positive. I kept in touch with him also when he moved to North Carolina, and I would call him every year or so. And last time I called him was about 1.5 years ago. And actually we decided I'll come visit him, and I'm really, really sorry I did not, something changed in the plans and I didn't visit him, and I'm really, really sorry. Thank you.
Bob was a member of the first generation of fusion energy researchers. It was 60 years ago that a young, enthusiastic rocket scientist who was working at Fairchild Engine and Aircraft Corporation attended a meeting in New York City, a meeting of the American Physical Society, and at this meeting there was hot news to be heard. The secret work on fusion research that had been going on for almost 10 years in the US, Soviet Union, UK, and France had just recently been declassified, like months before. And Bob attended a lecture given by Richard F. Post on fusion energy. He came away from that very excited and energized. He was fascinated by the challenge of fusion and wanted to learn more about it. And so he arranged, and he was invited by Edward Teller to go to Livermore to learn about fusion, along with 50 other young scientists that they were trying to recruit into the fusion program, for a 3-day seminar at Livermore, California. After that, Bob came back, and I'll now quote from a quote of his that was in one of the books on fusion history. Here's Bob speaking. "I came home all excited, paced the floor, thought maybe it's all just a fad." But he was hooked. He sold his house, took a leave from his rocketry job, packed his family in an old Ford station wagon, and made the journey west. After a year of studying fusion at Livermore, California, Bob Gross made his choice. 25 years later, in 1985, he had the following comment. "For reasons that I don't fully understand, even to this day, I decided that I was going to devote my life to fusion. The idea of bringing a whole new energy source to mankind and civilization, I said, that's something worth devoting my professional life to. It was so very idealistic. Everybody in this business is very idealistic. A fusion bomb was a terrible thing, but gee, it's also a great thing if we can control it. No more energy shortages." Remember, that was one of the drivers for the fusion program. Fusion would be a solution for all mankind forever. I really believed that then, and I believed it now, and I think he believed it for all of his life. I knew of Bob by reputation in the 60s and 70s. I first met him in person in about 1980 at a meeting in Aachen, Germany. We had a very good time discussing the world, fusion, and all of its challenges. And I remember his enthusiasm and his insights into the important aspects of fusion. And he had this interest that he carried over from the rocket days of supersonic combustion and shock dynamics, somehow then leading to a fusion burn wave passing through the fuel. That's something that he talked about quite a bit, even after he retired. Now in 1980, the US fusion budget was at its high point, almost $1 billion a year. People were building machines rapidly, new experiments were being carried out, fusion parameters were being pushed further and further towards the fusion reactor regime. Life was good. We were building many new facilities and expanding the frontier of fusion research. Unfortunately, the budget soon turned downward as the oil embargo of the 1970s faded from the government's memory. And in 1982, as fusion budgets were decreasing, the Department of Energy formed the first Magnetic Fusion Advisory Committee to advise the government on what to do with the priorities in the fusion program as budgets were declining. Bob was a charter member of that first MFAC committee, and they offered a number of suggestions on how to keep facilities operating and productive during this period of time. As the 1980s wore on, the situation actually got even a little more dire. And Bob was called upon to head a special advisory committee that was going to look into one part of the fusion program that had to do with how fusion plasmas are confined in a toroidal magnetic bottle, a donut-shaped magnetic bottle. And this committee that he chaired had only 6 members, and I think they, within a matter of a month or so, came back with a report that provided a sound blueprint for how to move ahead. And the advice was, first of all, to make sure that we exploited the resources and facilities that we had built during the good years of fusion, and to move ourselves forward towards plasmas that were behaving, had some of the characteristics of an actual fusion plasma. We call them burning plasmas. You know, fusion is really the process that powers the sun. And the sun burns. Nuclear reactions keep it hot. And so what we've been trying to do for the past 60 years is replicate that in the laboratory. And so as we are planning to do some experiments in the 1990s, Bob encouraged that we keep that path going to build, to complete the experiments in a facility that was the largest in the U.S. It was located at Princeton University in New Jersey. And with the help of collaborators from Columbia and others, we were able to continue those experiments forward. The plasma program from Columbia University, people who are in the audience tonight, Jerry Navratil, Mike Mall, and Steve Sabaugh, came down to Princeton and brought with them new ideas that they had developed here at the experiment on the Columbia campus. And they also brought something very important in addition, enthusiasm and energy that helped see us through this difficult time. And that's something that the laboratory really appreciated, their contributions. In addition, this Bob Gross panel in the mid-80s recommended that the fusion program begin and devote a significant part of its remaining resources, no matter what the budget level, to developing basically a better magnetic bottle for confining the plasma. There are all sorts of ideas, many of them coming out of universities, several coming out of Columbia University's plasma physics group on how to do this. That advice was taken and is still an important part of the U.S. fusion program moving forward, namely continual improvement and seeking new ideas that can make fusion more practical. As I said, the experiments that were carried out with the help of the Columbia collaboration came to their culmination in the mid-1990s with the production of 10 million watts of fusion power. Now that's what we mean by a burning plasma experiment. If someone asks you, when are they going to make fusion power? We say, well, we did that way back in 1994. That was a landmark experiment on the way to bigger experiments where you actually produce enough fusion power to more than you use to create the fusion plasma in the first place, so-called break-even type plasmas. That's yet to be done, but we're well on our way. This collaboration between Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory and Columbia University is an excellent example of the key role that Columbia and other universities have to educate the future scientists and to develop new and innovative ideas. And this is an example of the wide-ranging impact that Columbia Plasma Physics Group has made to plasma, fusion plasma theory, fusion experiments, both on HBTEP and collaborations on other facilities. And most importantly, one of the things Columbia has done is that they have had a significant effect on the direction of the National Fusion Research Program. They may not be the largest fusion group in the country. They may not be the best funded fusion group in the country, but they had a big impact. To use a sports metaphor, they pack a punch far above their weight. And you'll see their impact in many areas of the fusion program. Now, Bob, while he's no longer with us, his presence will still be felt. The Columbia Plasma Physics Group is a legacy that will live on, and expect to continue to provide stimulating ideas for new research directions, and of course educate the future scientists of the fusion program. And I expect that they will make key contributions towards his goal that he talked about way back in 1960. That goal is now ours as well, of providing fusion, a whole new energy source for the world. Thank you, Bob Gross.
It's a pleasure to be here and speak to you as both a researcher in plasma physics and fusion energy and a graduate of the Columbia program in plasma physics. As Dale described so nicely, Bob Gross was a member of a group of brilliant scientists that began the US program of research in fusion energy and also in the enabling science of plasma physics. Many scientists, or some scientists who are particularly adventurous, will switch fields, switch from a field in which they're trained to another existing field. But what Bob and his cohort of pioneers did, they switched to a field that didn't previously exist. They defined the new field of fusion energy research in modern plasma physics, and they began to develop it. So all of the pioneers, this is in the late 50s and very early 60s of the field, like Bob, were immigrants from another field of science. Many came from particle physics, nuclear physics, some from astrophysics, some came through the Manhattan Project. Bob was a little bit different because he came from engineering science, or what we might call today the applied physics. And I think that gave him a different perspective than the norm, and that, I think, is reflected in his research career, which was always unusually innovative and complementary to the mainstream of fusion energy research. Dale described that our field of fusion research and modern plasma physics began in 1958, and you can pinpoint the year because, as described, that's the year when all the research became declassified, and there was a historic conference in Geneva where everyone from around the world sort of showed all the research they were doing, and then plasma physics and fusion became a healthy, interactive, open field of research. That was 1958. It's remarkable that only 3 or 4 years later, Bob and Professor Chu founded the Columbia University academic program in plasma physics. When I think back at that, that took enormous gumption and foresight. This was almost a non-existing field just being born, and he had the wisdom to establish an academic program in it. I would think that would carry great risk. Well, of course, we know now 55 years later, he was right on target. Very quickly, the Columbia program became very eminent in the world, and it's remained a premier academic program in plasma physics to this day. Bob's scientific trajectory is very interesting. As you know, he came from work in fluid dynamics and shocks and combustion and ordinary gases. He appreciated that if you take a shock wave, which he knows very well, and you let it move very, very fast, it will ionize the gas in which it propagates, and it'll turn into a plasma, and it can heat the plasma to very high temperatures. These are known as electromagnetic shocks, and Bob developed a program at Columbia, an experiment and theory with Professor Chu that developed the field of electromagnetic shocks. In the laboratory, they drove shocks that moved at 1,000 miles per second and made plasmas that were as hot as 10 million degrees, which back then were really something. Shocks are critically important to astrophysics. In explosions all over the universe, there are electromagnetic shocks going on. Bob recognized this and noted it, but it wasn't his research interest. Yesterday, I mentioned to a younger colleague who was an astrophysicist, that I was going to a memorial service for a very special professor today. His name is Bob Gross. This astrophysicist entered science when Bob was retiring, and he works in a different field. And the fellow said to me, "Is that R. Gross?" I said, "Yes." "Is it the R. Gross that wrote the paper on shocks in the Reviews of Modern Physics?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, that's a fantastic paper. I've read it. I know it has had a big influence on me and my work in astrophysics." That paper that Bob wrote was written in 1965. So you talk about lasting impact. I was really blown away by that. Lasting impact, this is having a paper that's having an effect 50 years after it was published. But Bob's real interest with shocks was their use in fusion energy, because shocks can get these astronomically high temperatures that we need for fusion. So he conceived an approach to fusion. He called it wall-confined fusion. It worked a little bit like a car engine in a pulsed way. The mainstream approach to fusion was to confine a plasma in a very strong magnetic field and just hold it there indefinitely. But Bob envisioned a case where you shock heated a plasma to 100 million degrees, and you do it repetitively. And you put it in a weak magnetic field to give a little bit thermal insulation against the walls. Well, Bob was ahead of his time. At that time, the concept didn't go much beyond the Columbia work. But actually, today, many private companies have been an upsurge in private sector interest in fusion, and many of those companies are exploring an idea that was foreshadowed by Bob's wall-confined fusion. And a few years ago, the Department of Energy opened up a new program in this area of pulsed fusion at high density with weak magnetic field. In the trade, it's sometimes referred to as magnetized target fusion. And Bob's ideas from 40 years ago really were 40 years ahead of the time. Bob then, he always had an interest in making high temperature, high pressure, and then he, with his group, got into the tokamak research that Dale described, joined the mainstream, but brought ingenuity, and he and his colleagues learned how to manipulate the magnetic field, how to shape it, so as to increase the pressure that exists in the plasmas. And the plasma program, already eminent, I think became a role model for excellence in a university program in fusion energy. And what I mean by that is Bob built an experiment at Columbia that was on the leading edge at looking at these high pressure plasmas on a small scale. He would develop ideas with his colleagues and then export them to the major facilities that cost $1 billion and make those facilities work better. And that's a real model for how to do excellent research within university. And this has been carried on to this day by Jerry Navratil and Mike Mall. At that point, Bob became dean, and his orbit didn't intersect with mine so much. However, I did have one intersection with him in the area of fundraising. And when I graduated from Columbia, actually, I first took a job in the private sector at $17,000 a year, better than Jerry. But then 2 years later, I took a job at a university for $14,000 a year, so you beat me. And this is at a job at the university that Jerry graduated from. And I would contribute to Columbia when asked, and I would give $25, which in those days was a lot of money. And then one day, I got in the mail a letter from Columbia requesting a contribution from the engineering school, and it had guidance for how much you should give according to your income level. And it started at $75,000 to $125,000, then $125,000 to $175,000, $200,000 to $300,000, all the way up to $500,000. And I was really annoyed. Not every Columbia graduate is rich at an early age. And I was so annoyed, and then by happenstance, a couple of months later, I ran into Bob, visiting Columbia, and I told him this story, knowing full well that he would tell me that every dollar is important, and he would validate my $25. And when I told Bob this story, he gave me his ever-gracious smile, and he said, well, it takes a lot of $25 donations to add up to $1 million. And when he said that, I understood how he was so successful as a dean. My interaction with Bob was not only through learning about his contributions to science, but I was a graduate student here in the plasma physics program. And I entered graduate school in 1970, and thinking, it just occurred to me today, when I entered as a naive graduate student in 1970, this was a fully blown, excellent program. I had the impression it had been around 100 years, but actually it was only around for 8 years in 1970. So it was remarkable, the program that he built, and he built it when he was in his early 30s, by the way. Graduate students are supposed to suffer, but my 5 years as a graduate student here were absolutely wonderful. And I did not work for Bob, I worked for different professors, but it was clear to me from my first day in graduate school that Bob was the godfather of the program. His persona suffused the program, it defined the program, it set the sociology for the program. And he is so gracious and uplifting and fast-paced that is what the Columbia Plasma Program was in those days, and I'm sure it still is. It was kind of an urban program in that the laboratory then was smaller than the Columbia lab now. It was densely packed. There was a electron beam experiment next to a linear experiment that I worked on, and then through a little open archway, another experiment, then a shop, and then the shock tube. So it was all densely packed, very exciting. Every week, and there still is, there was a Friday colloquium where Bob and others would bring in the best researchers around the world. It was very exciting, and there's no question in my mind that the culture of the Columbia program of upbeat and unified and scientifically exhilarating was set by Bob Gross. So I think Bob, as just someone in the field and a former grad student, I see two lasting impacts. One clearly is the science that he has left behind. I don't know if it's more or less important. I'm tempted to say more important is through what he's done in the graduate plasma program, he's had a huge impact on all the lives of all of us that have gone through that program. And I certainly feel like I'm a major beneficiary of Bob Gross's contribution to Columbia and therefore to all the grad students. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you all. It's an honor for me to be here and help everyone, and especially Bob's family, celebrate his incredible life. I arrived at Columbia in the fall of 1962, already with an interest in plasma physics and controlled fusion. I was very happy to learn after I got here that there was a plasma lab, and it was quite nearby across the hall, actually the yard, which is now a building. And when I went over to see Bob, I was relieved to see that Mud Building was spelled with 2 Ds. I was concerned, of course, about that. When I went over to meet Bob, I sensed immediately, as Jerry and others have said, that this man had a smart, experienced, scientific approach to things, that he was really committed to building a great research and teaching institution in the plasma lab together with John Chu and others, and that he was truly passionate about attacking the exciting and challenging issues related to controlled fusion. In those days, controlled fusion was 25 years away, and now it's 25 plus X. So it was a tougher problem than I guess any of us thought at the time. Also, I should mention, as a physics student coming to the engineering building to talk to a professor about working in his lab for my thesis, I was a little concerned about how a physics student would be treated in the engineering school. And I needn't have worried because, of course, Bob, being extremely skilled as an administrator and a thinker, had arranged for a really transparent, collaborative process within the university. And that part of what he built, again, with John and others, is, in my view, a particularly important benefit that he left for all of us and everyone who followed him and the rest of us through the program. In the plasma lab, I became Amia Sen's first PhD student, and I stayed in touch with him closely over the years. As I suspect many of you know, he passed away about a month ago, and so we're all very sad about that. Many of the comments that I might have made about Bob's contributions have been made much more eloquently by people with distinguished careers in the field. So I'm skipping those comments, and I'd like to give you a couple of anecdotes, one of which stands out clearly in my mind. Bob saw me one day in the lab, or probably in that bullpen where all the grad students sat at their own desks. And I was wearing a Harvard rowing shirt. And he kind of gave me a funny look. He knew I'd come from Cornell, and he inquired about that and was surprised, not by anything he said, but by his body language, when he discovered I was still training competitively while attempting to get a PhD in physics in the plasma lab. And he seemed bemused. He was never judgmental. It was kind of, in retrospect, it was classic Bob Gross. I recall his lectures too, as I think most of us do, as being master classes in teaching and communication and motivation. And every one of the times I heard him speak, the thing that came through was his passion for attacking problems, getting answers, and solving big problems, as people have spoken about. He was relentless in wanting to crack open the science and get everyone further along toward controlled fusion. After Columbia and a postdoc, in 1972, I teamed up with some graduates from Columbia and one from Cornell to start a company that leveraged plasma technology, microwave plasmas, to start a company. And I think probably that Les Levine and Mickey Greenblatt are here, two of the members of that team. We instinctively and immediately invited Bob, pleaded with him to be an advisor. And he readily said yes and worked with us. We provided him, talked him into accepting a little bit of founder stock. That worked out well for everybody who had stock in the company, and we were really delighted that Bob was part of that. Over the subsequent decades, Bob and Ellie and my wife Nancy and I and our respective families stayed in touch and shared the joys of seeing the families grow and change and move. In 1995, Bob and Ellie moved to Chapel Hill, and so my contact with him was sporadic by phone. As the internet evolved and email became real, I remember talking with Bob. Of course, he was an enthusiastic early adopter. And he would tell me how much fun it was for him to get up every morning and look at his emails and get messages from his friends all around the world and across the country in different time zones, and then answer them and keep this ball spinning as part of his global community of friends and colleagues. In 1999, a group of Bob's friends and families and colleagues, former students, launched the Gross Scholarship And since 2003, when it started awarding scholarships, it's provided scholarships to applied physics undergraduates for 2 or 3 year terms, and there have been 6 of those so far. It's a great effort, and many of you here have contributed to it, and I'm confident that will continue. It's a great tribute to Bob to have that scholarship going, and it really helps talented undergraduates. Bob and I kept in touch. Our son, Nancy's and my son, entered the University of North Carolina to do his PhD in physics in 2006. So we began visiting Chapel Hill. And one of the big benefits of that was that I would manage to see Bob on almost every trip. As they started a family, the frequency and the duration of these visits rose. And so we really enjoyed those visits. And one of the eternal memories for me about Bob is that every time I visited, when it was time to leave, he would get up. He was usually in his easy chair, and we'd have a really nice chat. Although sometimes we had dinner or lunch, and a couple times he came to our kids' house, met our grandkids and such. But the normal routine was he would get up, he would insist on walking me to the door. He would stand on the little porch by his door looking at me get in the car and back out his fairly long driveway with a few curves in it. I guess he was worried about it a little bit sometimes. And then as I turned to drive away, he would smile and wave, and that was just part of the routine, and we all loved it. That was just great. Bob and I independently began going to the UNC, University of North Carolina Fitness Center for our workouts. And so occasionally we'd run into each other there. And I was surprised one day to see Bob on the rowing machine. You remember my little story about the rowing shirt, okay? So I kidded Bob about it, and remembering that little incident, I asked Bob if he would like any coaching. And he smiled and said, "No, I'm just getting good exercise and enjoying it." But that was an unexpected and joyous little encounter we had that day. The other thing I wanted to be sure to mention is that when I was sitting and chatting with Bob over these years, one of the daily things that energized him that he looked forward to were phone calls from his sons and from John Chu, because they shared a lot, and I'm sure he and John argued a lot, and they both loved it. Right, John? You don't have to comment. But that was really important for him, as well as neighbors that he was really close to and caregivers who were superb and totally devoted to him. He was the kind of person that attracted and supported and fed back positive vibrations to all these folks. So I was fortunate, very fortunate, to see Bob a few weeks before he passed. And while I was deeply saddened, like everyone here, to learn of that, it was soothing to know that his passing was swift and serene. He deserved that. We all hope for that. So together with many of you, I owe a great deal of who I am to Bob Gross. He was a kind and generous person to everyone he encountered. He was also a splendid teacher and a mentor and a father figure to me. So I will miss him even as I continue to thrive on the wonderful example that he set for all of us about how to live a good and positive and giving life.
So
I'm honored to give this talk. Thinking about it made me think of my years as a graduate student here at Columbia. And bring back my thoughts to that time. How I viewed Columbia as a graduate student, and how I viewed my advisor, who was Bob Gross, as a graduate student. In 1966, I was finishing a master's degree in aerospace engineering at Cornell, and I talked to my advisor about graduate schools. He told me plasma physics is the same as aerospace engineering, and Bob Gross has a great plasma group at Columbia, so I applied. To explain why he said that, shock waves were the focus of research in aerospace at Cornell, and at the time ionizing shocks were the main focus of research in the Columbia group. I later found out that Bob had also a background in aerospace engineering, and he had moved into plasma physics because of his interest in ionizing shock waves. Bob's idea was that shock waves that ionize the plasma behind them are a potential way of going towards fusion energy. At the time, there was a small shock tube in the front area of what's presently the Plasma Lab, which had produced several PhD theses. And the major effort, so this was 1966, the major effort of the group was the building of a much larger shock tube. At the time, plasma physics at Columbia was an interdepartmental group, interdepartmental committee. So I wasn't in a department. I was within this interdepartmental committee headed by Bob. It was a small and very close group. And actually thinking back, at this time, the methods of research were much more primitive. For example, I think when I first interviewed with Bob, he was telling me that there has been a great leap forward in the ability to do experiments in plasma physics due to the invention of Polaroid. Previously, you would do experiments. You might be working into the night, but then you'd go to a dark room that was on the second floor of Columbia, and you'd work even later developing the film that you had taken. So due to Polaroid, you were able to instantly see what was happening on your oscilloscope. In addition, or I should add, that this very good professional level darkroom was still there when I was there from 1966 to 70, and it was a very nice resource for graduate students who are interested in photography. The Plasma Lab also, as Stuart said, it was very packed with experiments. They also had a Q machine, which is a device that created a low temperature cesium plasma, and it was used for basic plasma physics studies. This same device was later modified by Ameya Sen, who put in a hydrogen source to replace the cesium source. Bob suggested to me a Q machine experiment on magnetic mirror confinement, which actually led to my thesis. Generally speaking, my research went smoothly, though not always. So one story is this. Once I was working late, maybe around midnight in the lab by myself, which in fact I wasn't supposed to be doing. Anyway, as I was turning up the magnetic field to the highest level that was possible, all of a sudden there was a flash of light, a burst of thunder, and water started spreading out, coming out of the experiment, and everything turned off. Actually, an arc had formed between the high voltage on the magnet and ground, and it had made a hole in the water pipe that led water into the magnet. I was afraid to tell Bob about this accident, but I remember about a week later I had a dream that I was working in the lab and the Q machine caught on fire, and I was running around to put out the fire. And then Bob walked in and he said to me, are you sure you really want to be an experimentalist? Actually, I never figured out that question. Anyway, my experiment eventually yielded nice results, and I worked maybe for the next 20 years on magnetic mirror confinement. Another story, in the late 60s, Bob was among the first American scientists to go to visit what was the Soviet Union at the time. And when he came back, he gave a talk to the group of what he had seen. And he described this fat Taurus that the people in Kurchatov in Moscow were very excited about, that they called a tokamak. And that was the first time I had heard the word tokamak, though I'm not sure that was the first time it was uttered in this country. My time at Columbia was 1966 to 1970, turned out to be a turbulent but interesting and exciting time to be in New York. As people remember, the Vietnam War was becoming an increased source of unrest on college campuses, and it very directly affected all male students who had to worry about how they could avoid the draft if they wanted to. And that led to the following Columbia history, which has been written about. In 1968, almost 50 years ago to this day, because it was at the end of April, on a nice sunny day when people didn't feel like going to classes, the students decided to take over 4 buildings, including Low Library, which included the office of the president. After about 2 weeks of fruitless attempts to and they presented the administration with, I think, 6 demands. After fruitless attempts to negotiate between the administration and the students and the faculty, finally the New York City riot police were called in. Late one night, we heard a rumor that the police were coming. As it turned out, students were arrested, but it really turned into a police riot, and a lot of students were hospitalized. The next morning, I walked up on campus to see what was there. I lived on 114th Street. And there was a long line of faculty, and somewhere in the line I noticed was Bob and John Chu standing there. So I went over to talk. And Bob asked me what had happened, because I had been there, and I explained to him what I saw. I think he could tell that I was very upset recalling the police riot. But we talked for a while, and I felt better. And in fact, I was thinking that maybe I should move to Canada, but after talking to Bob, I decided to stay at Columbia. Now, we had many different conversations, and I want to, the next is a personal comment that Bob made to me that has stuck in my mind. At one point, when I was thinking of getting married, and I told Bob that I was thinking of getting married, and he said to me, Bob was very articulate, and I always liked the way he phrased things. Anyway, he said to me that when he got married, it was Ellie's wisdom more than his own, but that he never for a moment regretted that decision. So in summary, I want to say Bob Gruss was a great academic advisor. He was always encouraging and supportive. He was also a father figure to me, and he was also a friend to me. Thank you.
It is a very great pleasure to be here, although it is not a very happy occasion. Bob and I have been old friends since 1963. And until his retirement, even though he moved to North Carolina, we still kept in touch with a reasonable frequency, like once a month or so. And he and I worked on many things together, starting with shock waves, etc. And I diverted into applied mathematics in general. He not only was not jealous of my diversion, but he encouraged me tremendously. So he's a very intelligent and broad-minded human being, which I appreciated very much. In 1964 or thereabouts, I came to Columbia for the first time. Having taught at NYU Engineering School for 4 years and just received tenure, I decided I had a horrible, incompetent chairman, and I decided whether tenure or no tenure, it's not worthy of staying there. So I came to Bob at Columbia. He had no faculty opening, so I became a research associate for a couple of years. And then openings opened up, and I became an associate professor in the department, which is a fact I never regretted the move. He and I had many things in common, among which is the unrespectable sport of watching football. We were every Saturday on Columbia football field watching us usually being beaten, but periodically a victory did come. Bob is a tremendously good colleague and a tremendously good senior colleague. He usually had good ideas about things, a little bit too practical and a little bit too commercial-minded, but nevertheless sound and useful and good. So we had a very good time together. Now, is it called a type A mentality? Type A personality. I am also one. We have never had a war. And that is amazing. We even talked about it, and he said, yes, he has gone through the procedure of reckoning what happens if we fought. And he decided that this would be devastating for both of us. And he resisted the instinct to fight me. I did not go through a similar procedure. He was senior to me in both age and in position, so I deferred to him out of fear. It's not out of wisdom. But anyway, I had a very good time with Bob, and whether doing science or watching football, we had a great time together. The only thing about Bob that was slightly negative is we took language classes in Russian together. And I was fairly good with languages. He was not too good with languages, and so he lagged behind. Moreover, there was a very beautiful lady in the class, and he got mesmerized by the lady. So he was forbidden by his wife to continue. So he never finished a Russian course. Anyway, it was good to have worked with Bob, and I miss him even now. I've retired almost a decade, but I still consider him a very important person, and I miss him even now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chu. If my dad was here, he would say, "my comrade," and that's how they would always refer to each other. And let me thank all of the previous speakers for your kind words and memories of our father. Let me especially thank Dean Boyce, Mike Mall, Christina, and the other faculty and staff for arranging such a wonderful memorial event. Thank you very much. Thank you. There's no question, and you all know it, that our father loved Columbia in all its aspects. He loved the School of Engineering, the Department of Applied Physics, his students, and his colleagues. I could easily talk about his abundant talents as a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, friend, and fishing buddy. He was a very talented fisherman. You most probably didn't know that, but he was. And he brought that love to me, and those were very special times. However, the topic of this event is his contributions to the university, teaching, and the field of fusion plasma physics. What I believe, and I know in my heart, was my dad's strength that enabled him to be so successful was that unique combination of scientist and engineer, teacher, and administrator. There are many great scientific and engineering minds, many or some in this room today, from the past and present. There are an abundant number of talented and inspirational teachers. And there's many effective administrative executives. But the people that occupy the overlap of these three in that Venn diagram are very few. And he occupied that space with distinction. I do need to recognize that he didn't do it alone, and I recognize my mother's contribution to this in the interpersonal aspects of each of these areas. He's a very wonderful, loving man and stuff, but a lot of what you saw in terms of how well he interacted with people, my mother was a big help. And when my family would gather around the dinner table, and he would talk about his day's happenings at the university, you could just see and feel the joy that he had for a breakthrough at the lab, and for the successes of his students, and for the resolution of an administrative issue. And he really enjoyed all those aspects. There's also the corollary. He was also disappointed when an experiment was a dry hole. He was disappointed when a doctoral student did not make progress on their thesis at the rate that he thought they should. In later years, in talking to him, as was talked about earlier, he took great joy in the early, I remember many years saying, break even, it's 2 decades, maybe 3 decades away, but we're going to get there, we're going to get there. And of course, he was disappointed years later when we would talk about it, and he said, break even is 2 or 3 decades away. But he knows that it will happen, and it's because of some of the people, many of the people in this room, that will happen, and our world will be a better place for it. He also would talk eloquently about, the administrative issues, and he had great joy in when he solved those things, but that when he was not able to resolve some turf war, either physical, there was never enough space in the building, or career, there was never a lack of ego in academia. But he was, and oh, by the way, of course, the disappointment of each Columbia University football loss. Yeah. Now, he did go directly to solving problems in a very practical way, has been talked about here. So in terms of, he recognized the fact that, limited space and limited places, so solve the problem. He built a building, and we thank him all for that and the results from that. His love of teaching did not end as he left campus. I'll tell you about this, as his greatest student challenge is standing before you. I can attest to it as someone who, in today's PC words, had learning differences. I tested his patience and abilities. Can you imagine having Professor Gross teach you your math facts? I still have a bit of a mental stutter each time I think that 6/8 are 48. I'm a bit curious how many people here had their writing edited by my father? Raise your hand if you ever had any editing. And he used this red flare pen. I found one, actually. To this day, I shudder at these, but I became a powerful writer and a good writer because of his abilities and his patience. And in fact, have made a living in marketing and other areas from that. Now, let me also tell you a little bit about my view of the development of the Plasma Lab. Now, I assume for all of you it was a serious place to make engineering breakthroughs that would one day change the world. For me, it was a very cool Dr. Frankenstein lab of electricity, magnetism, and liquid nitrogen, equal to anything that Shelley or Kenneth Strickfaden, and if you don't know who that is, ask me later, could think up. When I was in the lab, I took the NASCAR view of each experimental run. While you were all hoping for some data that provided that you were on the right path, I secretly hoped for some spectacular failure of a capacitor bank insulator, misplaced magnetically attractive object that would cause some excitement. And apparently I can thank a little bit, Jay, thank you very much for one of those instances. I didn't know it was you, but thank you. And in fact, it was interesting in listening to this, and I just noted down here, one of my spring break projects, I would go into the university with my father, particularly in junior high school and high school during winter breaks and spring breaks and things like this. And one of my spring break projects was to decommission the Q machine, to take it apart. And I had a lot of fun. Demolition is a lot of fun. And I remember going home and telling my mom how much fun it was taking this thing apart, and that there was this, all this stuff that was attached to it, and this white material around this piping that was sort of dusty and all. And my mother looked over at my father, realizing that I had just taken down a lot of asbestos without any protection. So it was not. So I'm glad to be here today, despite some of these lab incidents. Yeah. Now, and a great memory and to tell you a little bit about how times have changed, when was mentioned about the fact that when my father first was introduced to fusion and uprooted our family from the East Coast and went to the West Coast to Berkeley for those lectures. And yes, it was a Ford station wagon. And the way we did that was that it was this Ford station wagon, and all our stuff was up on top on a roof rack, and they just put a mattress in the back of the station wagon, and David and I just played in the back of the station wagon. Today, he would have been arrested for child abuse, but, it was a lot of fun. There's a Hebrew phrase, Yimlach Shemo, and it's roughly translated, may his name be obliterated. It is one of the worst and strongest curses in the Hebrew language. As Jews, we don't glorify death or have a strong life after death concept. Instead, we celebrate life, and it's obvious here in the celebration. And how our lives touch the people in our lives and help perfect the world. A person is not truly gone until there is no one left that remembers them and the difference they made in the world. This event and your participation is profound proof of the blessing of our Father's life. Thank you very much.
First of all, as my brother did, let me thank all of you for coming here on a dark and dreary Friday evening. We appreciate that very much. As my brother also said, we especially appreciate Columbia and Columbia Engineering for hosting this, for the dean to have organized this, for Mike and for Jerry and for everybody else for doing so. Christina did a remarkable job. Let me be clear. Our family is purely the beneficiary. We had nothing to do with the organization. All the quality work was done by Columbia. Now, I don't have very much time because we're running late, and my dad, as you heard, had a wonderful, long, and very full life. So I'm not going to mention a lot of things, a lot of important things. For example, I'm not going to mention his love of travel, which was born from growing up as a poor boy in Philadelphia, reading the books of Richard Halliburton. And I certainly won't have time to talk about how his education was interrupted by World War II and being drafted, and then being sent off to a place that he didn't know existed because he was doing cryptography at a place that is now known as the NSA, the National Security Agency. My brother and I had no idea, by the way, that my dad had ever done anything like that for virtually our entire growing up time. But then eventually, after many, many, many years, Dad told John Henry and me what he had done. A number of years after that, I was in the government and I was talking to the director of the NSA about some things which I won't talk about, but what I will tell you is that I mentioned to the director that my dad had been in the precursor of the NSA, and that during my entire growing up period, I had no idea what he had done. The director looked at me and said, "Finally, I found somebody in the government who can keep a secret." I will also say, as a result of that, my dad never had a high opinion of government intelligence work, but that's a whole different story as well. I also, unfortunately, don't have time to talk about his great athletic abilities. He was a varsity swimmer at the University of Pennsylvania. I never once beat him in tennis my entire life, in singles, ever. I also don't have time to talk about some of the things that we've heard about today. His competitive juices were always flowing. He got his PhD in 3 years at Harvard, in part because he didn't want to waste a moment. Also, he knew he had to finish in order to marry my mother, a person he had known since they were in camp together as little kids. That's a completely different story. I won't talk about the fact that they took his first trip he took right after World War II and the profound impact it had on our family. He found relatives of ours in the camps after the World War II. He climbed the Matterhorn. and he had a lifelong love of the Alps and mountains, as well as fishing, as my brother indicated. I certainly don't have time, thank goodness some people have talked about his groundbreaking work on jet and rocket engines, which he did right after he graduated from Harvard and when John Henry and I were born and we were living out on Long Island. And I don't have time, and fortunately many of you have talked already about our moving out away from the only world he had known, and my mother had really known, on the East Coast, to go out to Berkeley for a year, and then not knowing at all that he would ever come back to the East Coast, at least to live, but then coming back to join Columbia. So instead of discussing Dad's incredibly rich early life, let me focus on just two things that Dad really, really cared about. One is family, and the second is Columbia University, football. My dad loved college football from the days of growing up in Philadelphia, going to the University of Pennsylvania. 60,000 people in Franklin Field. We have letters that he wrote about that time, talking about how exciting it was to be surrounded by 60,000 cheering people. He returned to Columbia, or came to Columbia in 1960-61, just in time for Columbia to win its only football championship in the Ivy League. I think my dad thought that was the beginning of a trend, and in fact, it was not at all the beginning of a trend. As my brother indicated, and as John Chu talked about a little bit, every Saturday during football season, we went to Baker Field, now no longer known as Baker Field, but then known as Baker Field, to tailgate with our family and friends and to watch football and lose. I will say, as a number of people have noted, we didn't always lose. Occasionally we'd win, and occasionally we'd beat Princeton, and I have to tell you, nothing gave joy to my father more than a football game beating Princeton. But let me also talk just a little bit about how important family was to my dad. As my brother indicated, he saw Columbia as his family. During the time that Jay referred to in the riots here at Columbia in 1968, it was a very difficult time for everyone. It was a difficult time for my dad for a number of reasons, one of which was that he hated to see his family, the students, the faculty, and the rest of the community fighting each other. He also was upset because it was interfering with his research, but that's also another story. But my father loved his family, not only his Columbia family, but our family, many of whom are here as well, deeply and without reservation. I'm so pleased that a number of you have remembered my mother in talking about my dad, because really, there is no understanding my father without thinking about him and my mother, because they were truly one. We saw that throughout our growing up. Not just a deep love that was enduring, but rather a complementary love, where my mother was able to organize my father, able to remember all of your names, because my father never did, and be able to work with him, feed his love of travel, feed his love of working and science, hoping to raise my brother and me, and to bring a true family sense of where everything was done together and for our greater common good. And so my mother, who was known as a Fufka the manager, because she would manage everything in some fashion or another, loved everyone here who she knew. And she was an important part of the Columbia family, having drawn my father out of his sort of shell to live on the East Campus, to get an apartment on Riverside Drive so they could be more involved in the Columbia community in his later years, and then to make sure that my father was able to accomplish all that he wanted to accomplish personally as well as professionally. I'm also very pleased that people have recognized the optimism of my father. And it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that we live in a very difficult time. My father, when he went to Europe right after World War II, met a young woman on the boat that he was taking there, and they became lifelong friends, I will quickly note, with my mother as well. And he wrote to her right after World War II letters of encouragement, telling what they were each doing back and forth. And my dad said in one of those letters to her, during a time that was every bit as difficult as the world is today, and arguably much more uncertain and difficult even than today. And he wrote the following that I think captures much of what my father thought. He said, "I agree that I am too idealistic, but if we young people are not so, then who is to be? We must not be cynical or pessimistic when confronted with seemingly impossible tasks or a very heavy burden. It is necessary that we, the new generation, realize the mistakes of the past, but we must never lose courage in the future. It is up to us to work and to live for the type of world we wish to live in. Of course, it is not easy. Nothing good is. And you might say that we are only little people, but there is that the progress must be made." That tells you my father's thinking at an early age that brought him to plasma physics and fusion. Tough issues that are difficult and uncertain to solve, but worth it. It tells you about the optimism of his life and his view that the world would get better. And it tells you the life that he lived and the ones that we celebrate. So, my father lived such a life. He lived such a life through science and through the personal interactions in the way in which he lived his life with all of you and with many others around the world. He was an extraordinary person. He was my hero. He was my father, and I love him so. Thank you very much.